Before beginning today's episode, I should give a short update on my personal situation. I have been spending much of the year away from my home, and thus have been unable to record audio or edit video, hence the lack of any uploads. I have briefly returned with only enough time to record the narration for this episode, so I hope you will not mind the lack of the usual audio-visual accoutrement. At another time I will return to complete this video properly, but for now I suppose that something is better than nothing. Thank you for your patience and support, now and into the future. I hope you enjoy the following episode. Last time, King Demetrius II Nicator had been taken prisoner after a failed campaign against Parthia, allowing his brother, Antiochus VII Sidetes, also known as Eusebius, to assume the throne. Following this, Antiochus had rapidly defeated Diodorus Tryphon, a rather successful Syrian rebel who had taken significant parts of the empire and had declared himself king. Now that Seleucid control over the imperial core in Syria had been re-established, the next most pressing issue was that of Judea, as the Jewish nation had taken the opportunity presented by the lengthy civil war to assert its independence. A certain Athenaeus was sent as an ambassador to Jerusalem, where he demanded financial recompense be paid to the Seleucid state and her citizens, who had been deprived of their lands and property as a consequence of the military campaigns of the Maccabees. The requested sum totaled to 1,000 talents of silver, an impressive, albeit not unreasonable amount, given the lands which had been seized. Simon Thassi, high priest of Jerusalem, responded to this demand by claiming that captured territories were the ancient lands of the Jewish people, and thus were rightfully part of Judea. He instead made an offer of just 100 talents in compensation. Athenaeus, evidently a mere ambassador and not empowered as a plenipotentiary, gave no immediate reply to this offer, but conveyed it back to his king. Antiochus was enraged by the insolence of Simon, and now a new conflict in Judea became inevitable. As the Seleucid state was still recovering from the devastation of the civil war, a full invasion force was not mustered. Instead, circa 138 BC, the king appointed a man named Candabaeus as governor of Colle, Syria, and dispatched him with a small force to probe the strength and resolve of the Jews. The governor first moved into Yamnia, then went inland to Kedron, which he proceeded to fortify as a base of operations, whence he launched raids upon the highways and byways of Judea. Simon took to the defence of his land with aplomb, setting up many ambuscades against the Seleucid marauders amongst the steep hills and narrow valleys. A full-scale engagement is described in 1 Maccabees, which is of some dubious purport, in which the sons of Simon, John Hyrcanus and Judas, led 20,000 men to meet the Seleucids by a stream on the plains beyond Modane. It is told to us that Hyrcanus deployed his cavalry in the middle of his infantry, which would be an inversion of standard Hellenistic warfare, as the horse normally would almost always be placed on the wings. Generously, we could consider this to be some sort of ambuscade of infantry among cavalry, as Caesar would later do at Pharsalus. Alternatively, the details of the battle could be a whole cloth invention of an author who was unfamiliar with the minutiae of military strategy. In any case, Hyrcanus and Judas gained a victory, putting the Seleucids to flight, who they pursued to Azotus. There the Maccabees set the city ablaze, with the resulting conflagration taking the lives of 2,000 Seleucid men. Thus, Candabaeus' campaign against Simon proved unsuccessful, with the Seleucid military once again having been expelled from Judea. No immediate follow-up would come from Antiochus. Rather than coming by the hand of a vengeful king, the ultimate end of Simon Thassi would instead come from an act of treachery. His son-in-law, Ptolemy, son of Ababus, governor of the plains of Jericho, had made designs to gain control of Judea for himself. In early 134 BC, Ptolemy invited Simon and his family to a feast at his fortress, known alternatively as either Doc or Dagon. All of the priestly family attended, with the exception of John Hyrcanus, who was on other business in Gazara. At this banquet, much wine was served, and upon Simon and his sons becoming intoxicated, the conniving Ptolemy and some armed men rushed into the dining hall. They murdered Simon and his sons, along with some of their servants, while imprisoning the priest's wife. A group of assassins were sent to kill Hyrcanus, but, forewarned by a survivor of the massacre, he managed to escape their clutches and, with desperate speed, made for Jerusalem. Ptolemy had also set off for Jerusalem in order to seize control of government, but by the time he arrived the citizens had learnt of his attempt against the life of Hyrcanus, if not also of his act of regicide, and denied him entrance. John Hyrcanus was declared as the new high priest, while Ptolemy, having failed in his evil endeavour, fled back to his fortress, which he prepared to withstand a siege. Hyrcanus mustered an army, pursued the murderer to Dagon, and invested the murderer's tower. The dark soul of Ptolemy was now put on full display, as Hyrcanus' mother was dragged to the battlements of the fortress, where she was beaten and tortured in full sight of her son, with the violence to continue unless the siege was lifted. The siege dragged on in such fashion for months, with Hyrcanus spiritually beaten down by the continuous assault against his mother, so much so that he never attempted to storm the fortress. Instead, by September, the sabbatical year of Shemitah had begun, and so, observant to religious law, the siege was lifted. Ptolemy used this opportunity to flee to the court of Zenon in Rabbatamana, but not before finally ending the life of Hyrcanus' mother. The final fate of Ptolemy is unknown to history, but in the Divine Comedy of Dante, the man was placed in the 9th circle of hell for his sin of treachery. It was now, with Judea weakened by the loss of Simon, and in the midst of the sabbatical year, that Antiochus finally made a serious move against Judea. At the head of a proper Seleucid royal army, he marched south and laid waste to the land. The Maccabees were in no position to provide any effective resistance in the field. Thus, by November of 134 BC, Hyrcanus had been bottled up behind the high walls of Jerusalem, with Antiochus laying siege, having surrounded the walls with a double line of trenches and 7 armed camps. Construction was soon started on a multitude of 3-story high siege towers, although work was interrupted by regular sorties from the Jewish defenders, who would wreak havoc upon the siege works and then would beat a hasty retreat once the Seleucids responded in force. With the city lacking in stored provisions due to the constraints of the sabbatical year, the defenders were soon forced into a severe state of rationing. As the siege dragged on and the few supplies dwindled, Hyrcanus made the decision to expel from the city all those who were incapable of fighting, women, children, and the elderly. Antiochus, however, did not allow these refugees to pass through his lines, so they remained stranded in the no-man's land between the two armies, much as would later occur in history at the Battle of Alesia between Caesar and Vercingetorix. Gradually these non-combatants starved and were on the verge of death when October came, and with it Sukkot, the Feast of the Tabernacles. In the spirit of the festival, the civilians were brought back within the walls of Jerusalem, and Hyrcanus formally requested a ceasefire from Antiochus for the 7 days of the celebration. Antiochus was far more politically astute than his great uncle when it came to his treatment of Judaism. Not only did the king grant the requested truce, but he went much further, creating a great pious spectacle by sending a magnificent sacrifice to the temple, consisting of bulls with gilt horns and chalices of precious metal filled with rare spices. Josephus reports that on account of this act, Antiochus became widely known as Eusebius the Pious. This period of truce brought with it an opportunity for negotiation, and so Hyrcanus requested terms from the Seleucid king. At this, the king's companions, who by now had grown to detest these belligerent Jews, urged him to follow in the footsteps of Antiochus IV Epiphanes and to utterly wipe out the Jewish nation and religion. Interestingly, Diodorus claims they used as an example of Jewish wickedness their exodus from Egypt, framing it as a forced expulsion on account of their impiety towards the Egyptian gods, which had caused disease in the land. However, unlike some past Hellenistic monarchs who had been supremely inflexible, Antiochus was more than willing to deal diplomatically with the Jews, rejecting the opinions of his councillors. And he replied to their envoy with the following terms: that the Maccabean troops would surrender their arms, that Jerusalem would once again accept a Seleucid garrison, and that recompense was to be paid for the bordering cities which had earlier been seized by the Jews. Essentially, this would be a reset to the earlier position of a Judea under the Seleucid yoke, but with the autonomy to self-govern. The thought of the hated Acra fortress being rebuilt was intolerable to the Jews, so they proposed a counter-offer, that, rather than a garrison, they would instead send hostages to Antioch, including Hyrcanus' own brother. This proved to be an acceptable alternative to Antiochus, and peace was agreed upon. The gates of Jerusalem were flung open, and the Seleucid king entered in triumph. In order to pay the indemnity owed, Hyrcanus unsealed the tomb of King David and handed over 300 talents worth of its treasure to Antiochus. As one last act to make clear the status of Judea, the walls which had so recently been built up by the Hasmoneans were torn down, so that Jerusalem would not be able to be defended in the event of another war. Jewish power in the region had been broken, but in such a way that their religion and way of life had not been impeded, nor had they been particularly humiliated. As such, it seemed that, for now, Antiochus had successfully brought stability to the Levant. We know little of the domestic policy of the king at this time, but we do have a slight insight into his character from Athenaeus, who describes him as a great gourmand and an enthusiastic imbiber, but also a generous one, holding public feasts every day, for which wagon loads of food were prepared, so much that people carried away whole joints of meat and whole birds to consume at another time. In this sense, he does seem to follow after Antiochus Epiphanes, although most of the Seleucid kings were overfond of drinking. While he had been busy with his campaign in Judea, Sidetes had also dispatched envoys of goodwill to Rome, as was typical, as maintaining cordial relations with the Mediterranean superpower had become nearly essential. These ambassadors brought with them expensive gifts for the famed consul Scipio Aemilianus, who had presently been waging war against the Numantines in Hispania. Although addressed to him personally, Aemilianus had the items entered into the public registry and distributed to those men under his command who showed particular bravery. This public acceptance of a goodwill gift from Antiochus was a sign that there was currently no hostility from Rome towards the Seleucid state. Given this, and given that by late 132 BC, the Ptolemies in Egypt had once again fallen into another civil war, the king was now afforded the luxury of looking towards the east. Back in 138 BC, Antiochus' older brother, Demetrius, had campaigned there against the Parthians, which had ended disastrously in his own capture. In the intervening years, the former king had generally been treated well. He was permitted to administer his own household, and he was given a royal bride. However, he had not consigned himself to his fate, and he sought to return to Syria. Secretly, he had been in communication with one of his old companions, Calamander, and they devised a plan for the king to escape. Having disguised himself, Calamander set out from Syria, through the desert, towards Hyrcania, where the Parthian royal court was based. He successfully reached Demetrius, and the two set off back towards the west. However, the disappearance of the king was quickly noticed, and horsemen were dispatched to track them down. The Parthians, knowing the lay of the land better than the Greeks, took a shorter route and cut off their path of escape. The two men were brought before the Parthian king Phraortes II, who praised the fidelity of Calamander to his friend, and allowed him to go freely. However, Demetrius was scolded and was ordered to be placed under stricter confinement. After some more years had passed in captivity, with Demetrius having had multiple children with his new Parthian wife, Phraortes became more trusting of him and relaxed the conditions of his imprisonment. No sooner had he done this than Demetrius again attempted escape and again was caught. This time, Phraates could not bear his presence, and so ordered the Seleucid king back into captivity without seeing him. Instead, in an act of mockery, he had delivered to him a pair of golden dice with which to entertain himself and to allow him to gamble with far less consequential outcomes. Perhaps Phraates would in any other circumstance have punished his prisoner more severely, but having a Seleucid king at hand was too potentially useful of a tool to throw away carelessly. As a side note, Phraates is often referred to as Arsaces in the ancient sources and on his coinage. This is because Parthian rulers regularly used the name of the founder of their dynasty as an honorific title, much in the same way that the Romans would later use the name of Caesar. In 131 BC, Antiochus Sidetes began his campaign against the Parthians. Over the preceding decades, they had gradually conquered further and further westward, most recently swallowing up the old Seleucid heartland of Babylonia, the original province of the empire. Phraates' continued imprisonment of Demetrius showed his intent to continue still further to the west. And so Antiochus sought to force a confrontation on his own terms. An enormous army was assembled. According to Justin, they numbered 80,000 strong, with 300,000 camp followers, while according to Orosius, they were 100,000, with 200,000 followers, including actors and prostitutes. This force also included a detachment of Jewish troops led by High Priest Hyrcanus, further illustrating the present relationship between Antioch and Jerusalem. It was said this army was of such enormous wealth that the soldiers had golden hobnails and ate off of silver plates, and that their tents were adorned with fine tapestries. The Seleucids met a Parthian force led by a general Indates near the Lycus River, the modern Great Zab, in Upper Mesopotamia, which resulted in a decisive victory for Antiochus. As earlier eastern campaigns had also done, he followed the Tigris downstream towards Babylon and Seleucia, winning another 2 battles as he went, and then finally liberating those cities from Parthian hands. As when Demetrius had gone east, it can be expected that the local Greek population, along with some of the other ethnic groups in the region, would have taken this opportunity to revolt, as the Parthian grip on this most western part of their empire was not yet firm. Indeed, a fragment from Diodorus Siculus suggests that the governor of Seleucia, Aeneas, was lynched by the inhabitants of the city. Seeing their chance, more and more peoples joined in this rebellion against Parthia, and in 130 BC, Antiochus continued his advance, retaking Susa and successfully marching into Media. By the winter of that campaign season, Parthia looked to be on the verge of complete defeat, with the Seleucid army now in a position to threaten the royal residences in Hyrcania. As such, Phraates dispatched an envoy to request of Antiochus his terms. They were as follows: that Phraates ratify all which the Seleucids had conquered, that all other territories the Parthians had occupied outside of Parthia proper be evacuated, that the remaining Parthian state pay regular tribute to Antiochus, and that Demetrius be freed from his imprisonment. Of course, these terms were so incredibly harsh and humiliating that Phraates could not even consider accepting them, so the war continued. This gross underestimation of his foe was an arrogant mistake on the part of Antiochus. Phraates was aware that he could not currently hope to defeat the ascendant Seleucids in a conventional field battle, so cunning and subterfuge were called for. The king released Demetrius, sending him with a detachment of Parthian troops back towards Syria, where he hoped to engender a civil war in Antiochus's rear. While there was no guarantee that the 2 brothers would be predisposed to conflict, the fact that Antiochus had married Demetrius' wife, Cleopatra, would at least create some tension. The Seleucid army was dispersed throughout Media in winter quarters, where they lived off of the local population. Upon word from Phraates, a network of Parthian spies and sympathizers riled up parts of the populace into attacking the billeted Syrian troops. At word of this, Antiochus, who was probably in Ecbatana at the time, took his personal guard and immediately set off to aid his assailed men. It was at this time that Phraates himself attacked. He had substantially bolstered his army with Sacer mercenary horsemen hired from the eastern steppe. Leading these troops, he intercepted Antiochus's force, who had gathered together some of his beleaguered men, but was still far short of his full imperial army. According to Julius Obsequens, swallows made a nest in the royal tent, an omen of ill fortune. Prior to the battle, the Seleucid king's staff officers pleaded with him to withdraw his force into the mountains to better combat the Parthian horsemen. Antiochus scoffed at this, saying that it was shameful for the conquerors to fear those who they had already conquered, and urged his men to have courage. But the wisdom of these generals should have been respected, as the far vaster Parthian army encircled and destroyed the Seleucids, Antiochus dying valiantly with his sword in hand. After the battle, Phraates buried his adversary with the honour befitting a king. According to Posidonius of Apamea, Phraates remarked, "Your courage and your drunkenness have ruined you, O Antiochus, for you hoped that, in your great cups, you would be able to drink up the kingdom of Arsaces." Some Seleucid soldiers managed to escape, such as a general named Athenaeus, who fled the field early in the peace. All the towns and cities he came to seeking sanctuary denied him, and Diodorus claims that he died of starvation. Antiochus's baggage was captured by Phraates, which included many members of the Seleucid family. Seleucus, the son of Antiochus, was taken to be raised in the Parthian court, while the daughter of Demetrius was added to the royal harem. With its leadership annihilated, the Seleucid army collapsed entirely in the face of the Parthian advance, as had often been the case with Hellenistic armies. Phraates rapidly undid the gains of Antiochus, sweeping westward. When he came to Seleucia, whose Parthian appointed governor the people had murdered, envoys from the city came to beg for forgiveness. In response, the king showed them a man, probably a Greek, by the name of Pithides. Both his eyes had been put out. This, Phraates informed them, was the fate of rebels. Tell this to your city. The messengers were stricken with absolute terror. Whether the king ultimately followed through on this threat, we do not know. Now that he had done away with one Seleucid king, Phraates dispatched a cavalry detachment in order to track down and recapture the other, but Demetrius managed to evade him and successfully made his way back to Syria. Having retaken all of the territories lost to Antiochus, next the Parthians intended to cross the Euphrates and capture Syria itself, now that the kingdom was effectively leaderless and defenceless. When the news of the death of King Antiochus came to Syria, and of the loss of his army, there was enormous outpouring of grief, especially from the women of Antioch, who had lost their fathers, their brothers, and their sons. We know precious little of Antiochus's domestic policy, which is unsurprising given how scarce times of peace were during his reign. However, it seems that he was generally beloved by the people of Syria. This is little wonder given how he had dramatically shifted their fortunes, at least for a time. He had found a broken kingdom in the midst of a long and bloody civil war. Not only had he quickly led the Seleucid faction to victory, but he had gone on to retake Judea for the empire, something that successive kings had failed to do, and did so in such a way as to make the Maccabees into his allies, rather than the embittered oppressed. Then the king had, leading his army from the front, decisively defeated the Parthians in battle after battle, in the manner of the Macedonian kings of old. However, the Seleucid kingdom possessed the very same vulnerability as these old kingdoms. If the monarch himself could be disposed of, then the army would collapse, and the state itself would, for a time, lose the ability to wage war altogether. Phraates of Parthia was aware of this fact, and cunningly exploited the impetuous bravery of Antiochus by drawing the Seleucid king into a battle for which he was entirely unprepared. Following victory after victory, the king must have thought himself to by now be, as a Homeric hero, able to sweep all before him through force of will alone. Yet, in this case, his epic was a tragedy, and the arrogance of Antiochus ultimately cost him his life. With him, the last genuine chance for a great resurgence of the Seleucid Empire died too. Next time, the Parthians threaten Syria, while the inept Demetrius Nicator begins a second reign as king, to the great dismay of his former wife, Cleopatra Thea. If you have any comments, criticism, or questions, please post them below, and thank you for listening.